Well, I'm Ben Madison. I'm the head of RE at Southend High School for Boys. I have been working as an AST prior to that, and I'm excited about what might be next. I've been asked to chair today and to introduce Dave, making sure that we're right in the right place. We're looking at me and Dave had a discussion about a concept within Christianity. This arises from perhaps the problem that liberal Christianity is something which is difficult to put your finger on. And as you say, Abby, it can be dry if you say this is what Christians are and this is what they believe, and then there's a danger of becoming incredibly vague if you say, well, they don't subscribe to this set of rules, it's something else. What is that something else? So that this session is about talking about what is liberal Christianity as interpreted from the Bible. How do you go about interpreting the Bible to establish, how a liberal Christian might think? And we want to use the topic of grace in order to do that. Dave is a vicar in North London. He has been described as a heretic. He is a controversial figure.
That'll be me.
I was looking at a review of one of his books recently that was described as a blasphemous soup of lies and dirt. So
somebody on Amazon.
That was your 2-star review. You should see the one.
That was a 2-star, right?
So I was really excited to find out more about what Dave has to say and how he imparts the idea of a spiritual centre, but whilst rejecting those dogmatic rules, which are perhaps the thing that scares off teachers and students. How do you make the Bible fizzy without offering a list of this is this and this is that? And in thinking about this session, I thought about how do I go about doing that with my students? And there are, of course, many answers, but the first thought was that if you gave a student a Bible and 3 highlighters, and red is for the things that are definitely false, and green is the things that are for definitely true, and then orange is the things which, well, maybe they are, maybe they're not. There's only one colour that's going to get used. And so if that is the case, and we aren't totally literal, then how do we go about interpreting that, acting upon it, and attaining what it is that we're supposed to attain, that state of grace? So Dave is going to take us through how he sees that.
Okay, thank you. Nice to see you all. I suppose the issue is that within Christianity, the Bible has a very, very particular role. In fact, in some places, almost becomes deified. Actually, I grew up in a Brethren church. If you have any idea what that is, but I remember. Saying rather humorously one time that in our church we believed in the Holy Trinity of Father, Son and Holy Scripture. And, the Bible does play, and it plays an important role because it is seen as a very key, perhaps to some people's minds, the key source of revelation of what we know about God and what we can say about God tends to be derived from the Bible. And I think it's undeniable, whether you're conservative, liberal or whatever, that Christians are, in some sense, people of the book. The book is a classic text that you can't really sort of just toss away and still be Christian. You may decide that's a good idea anyway, really. But so I see the key question really is in what sense does it reveal God? In what sense is it revelation? And how do we go about reading it? And I've been very influenced by, in my approach to the Bible, by a French philosopher called Paul Ricoeur, who would be seen really as the kind of guru of the world of hermeneutics, the world of interpretation. He himself he died a few years ago, but he was a French Protestant. He was a Christian, but most of his writings are not specifically religious. They're of much broader nature, although sometimes he does kind of focus in specifically on it. But one of the key sort of concepts that he had, which has become quite important to me, not just about the Bible, but I suppose about spirituality generally, is that he talks about a kind of dialectical movement that begins with what he calls a first naivete, a wide-eyed belief, an acceptance that as is, this is it. So toward the Bible, this is the Word of God. Every word's inspired by God. You can't question it. You can't sort of criticize it. This is the Bible. But it's not just about the Bible. Actually, it's about a whole way of looking at one's faith, really. There's that kind of wide-eyed belief. He then talks about, for many people, a movement towards a place of critical distance, where the questions come in, where it all begins to disentangle and fall to pieces. And because we live in a world that, it has a different kind of paradigm, a different way of thinking about things, the scientific outlook has sort of been a corrosive element on that kind of naive belief. And so for lots of people, we end up sort of finding this mishmash between our belief in the Bible and the world we live in just begin to clash and cause it all to fall apart. Ricoeur's got this lovely little phrase in which he says in one of his books, "Beyond the desert of criticism, we wish to be called again." And it's that sort of longing to kind of re-engage, because for an awful lot of people, the critical place is where it all ends. That's the end of their journey. A lot of people stop going to church, stop believing, and so on, and toss the Bible aside. Once those critical questions enter, it is, as I say, very toxic. But Ricoeur says there's the possibility of a second naivete. You can never go back to the first naivete. You can never return. Once you've left it, you can never kind of put these pieces back together again. It's all unraveled. You can't knit it back together. But that doesn't have to be the end. There is the possibility of a re-engagement. And I think it's in that area of re-engagement that things do become interesting, at least to me anyway. And so my approach to the subject, my approach to the Bible really begins with an unambiguous acknowledgement that there are historical and scientific and ethical difficulties with the text. There just are, which cannot be ignored and can't be bypassed. But it also requires that the text be read with a receptiveness. So in other words, I'm bringing both criticism and receptivity together and saying, yes, I think we need to be radically critical toward the text as a result of the world we now live in. But does that mean that the text has nothing to bring to us at all? I don't think so. So there's a kind of receptivity, and so we read both critically and receptively. My own relationship with the Bible could certainly be defined by those two elements. Over the years, I've variously loved and hated the Bible, and still do, actually. I see it as something, I've listened to it, I've ignored it, I've been irritated by it, I've been captivated by it. I studied academically the Old Testament, I specialized in that because I thought I hated it so much that I better take a look at it. And I actually fell in love with the Old Testament. I came to feel that actually in terms of literary text, that it's far superior than the New Testament, which is mostly written much more on the hoof. Whereas the Old Testament are texts that have been refined over many centuries. Sure, they express all kinds of sentiments and ideas that we may find deeply unnerving and perhaps obnoxious in places. But the stories, the narrative, I find to be profoundly engaging and interesting, really. And so I think that the maintaining this idea of criticism and receptivity, Ricoeur says that it's possible to find a path in and through criticism. So it's a post-critical approach, really, towards this second naivete. And he says that it's only by interpreting that we can believe again. So in other words, it's only by finding different readings, different approaches, different interpretations, different frameworks of interpretation. So in other words, the good book, so-called, I think, requires good reading. It requires a good reader. And what that means is, I think, a nuanced reading that is grappling with these two sort of factors of the sort of deeply critical, but also the kind of the radically open, if you like, really. And but this is a good reading must take seriously the fact that these texts are from a different time, from a different culture to our own, and you can't kind of set aside those kind of factors. Therefore, the Bible can't, in my view, be read in any real sense as being literally true. And in fact, I think the whole notion of literalness is or the truth is associated with literalness is ridiculous and childish, really. Anyone who enjoys literature, who enjoys films or, art in general, appreciates the fact that the truth and fact are not the same thing. That, I read lots and lots of poetry, not because it's literally true, but because it is deeply truthful. And so it's possible for text to be deeply truthful. The Life of Pi is a great example of this, really. That's what the whole story is about. This sort of thing of, is it this version or is it that version, and does it matter? Because the truth isn't really about the kind of factuality of a narrative, but about something more profound and transcendent that kind of is contained within it and transported through it. So good reading requires the reader to pay attention to the text, to be open or receptive to what it has to say, but it also demands that the reader asks questions of the text, perhaps very hard questions, and Ricoeur calls this exercise a hermeneutics of suspicion. So hermeneutics is the science or art of interpreting text, and a hermeneutic of suspicion suggests that we start by asking who or what the text excludes. Who is disadvantaged or damaged by the message of the text, both in the original context of the writer and in our own context today, in the way that it tends to be applied. And what to ask those kind of questions that get behind what's there. An example of this necessary suspicion can be seen in the way that African-American slaves, in many cases, refused to accept the authority of biblical teachings and their interpretation when those teachings appeared to validate racial prejudice and oppression. The slave community, as we know, was a very faithful community in terms of the message of Jesus Christ. But in spite of being persecuted, brutalized and killed, and their songs and their sermons and so on and so forth still are deeply rooted in kind of Christian spirituality, but they weren't blind to the impact of some of the Bible's teachings or the influence of human interpreters. Howard Thurman, who was dean of the chapel at Howard University, and he was also a spiritual advisor to Martin Luther King, offers a really excellent case in point in a record of what his African-American grandmother once said to him. This is what he writes. He said, "My regular chore was to do all of the reading for my grandmother. She could neither read nor write. With a feeling of great temerity, I asked her one day why it was that she would not let me read any of the Pauline letters. What she told me I shall never forget. During the days of slavery, she said, the master's minister would occasionally hold services for the slaves. Always the white minister used as his text something from Paul. At least 3 or 4 times a year he used as a text, 'Slaves, be obedient to them that are your masters, as unto Christ.' Then he would go on to show how, if we were good and happy slaves, God would bless us. I promised my Maker that if I ever learned to read, and if freedom ever came, I would never read that part of the Bible." So in her own way, this lady practiced a hermeneutic of suspicion. The preacher's text was in the Bible, but she contested it. Her perception of God and of divine grace was more compelling and authoritative than the text or its interpretation by the white minister. So I think a good reader will contest the text where necessary, will engage in a dialogue, an argument, a heated debate with the text, if you like. And I think that the problem with an awful lot of teaching of religion and teaching of the Bible, teaching of Christianity, is that it tends to exclude the possibility of that argument. In churches, through all my experience, of my life, I think that people have basically been discouraged and turned away from arguing with the text. Whereas I think actually that is where the really interesting stuff starts to happen, when you can come back and argue. And actually the text itself has any amount of stories and accounts of people arguing with God, of contesting what was supposed to be the revealed word of God. In more recent times, feminist theologians who focused attention on the androcentric and patriarchal assumptions and attitudes in the Bible, they've also exercised a hermeneutic of suspicion. Without dismissing the Bible as such, they resist any suggestion that God is revealed through texts that limit or denigrate women. Just don't accept them. interestingly enough, I was taking part in an interfaith forum recently, which was an interfaith forum specifically about sexuality. Turned out I was the only straight person on the panel. And there was a young Muslim woman there who was extremely feisty and very forthright, and a great sort of revelation to me, really. And in the question time, a woman sort of asked her what she thought about the sort of text in the Quran which give only a male line of inheritance and the possibility of a husband sort of beating his wife and so on. And she said, "Oh, I just don't believe them." And that's that kind of attitude of contesting, which I think is something that certainly has come through a lot of feminist theology. Elisabeth Schuster-Fiorenza, a feminist theologian, for example, argues that no biblical text that perpetuates violence against women, children or slaves should be accorded the status of divine revelation, if we do not want to turn the God of the Bible into a God of violence. And therefore, this has to be, there has to be that argument. During the early 20th century, a similar problem was recognized in respect to modern science, of course. The German theologian Rudolf Bultmann felt that modern people were being turned away from Christianity because the Bible no longer stood up in a scientific age. Bultmann felt that we had to demythologize the Bible, is the phrase that he used, to strip away its kind of mythological trappings so that its core message could be established and could be heard. So that also is a hermeneutic of suspicion, a questioning of certain assumptions and presuppositions in the Bible in the light of more recent understanding. So Karl Barth, one of the great theologians of the 20th century, held that you must always preach sermons with a Bible in one hand and a newspaper in the other. And I think, it's not necessarily a newspaper, it's a model of sort of saying, yes, this is a text which is a historical text. It's rooted in a particular culture and a particular history, and we live in this world which now understands things differently, and therefore we're faced with the exercise of bringing these two things together into a conversation and finding out what comes out of that particular engagement. So in my view, the good reader won't abandon the Bible because it assumes a three-tier universe, let's say, which it certainly does, or because it reflects a culture in which patriarchy or slave ownership are taken for granted, because these are not actually the essential messages of the Bible. The real purpose of the Bible is somewhere else, and perhaps you might say it is to draw us into a narrative quest to know and understand the divine, or whatever. And so it is a human book, though. And that's something which I think an awful lot of people find it really hard to say. But the Bible, of course, is a human book written by human beings situated in particular cultural settings at specific points in history. And whatever theory of divine inspiration you can attach to its writing, the fact is the Bible reflects the limited scientific, historical and social outlook of its writers. So a hermeneutic of suspicion is directed at uncovering the humanness and the situatedness, if you like, of the text. And I'd say in the process of that, it helps us to overcome idolatry and dogmatism that's often attached to a kind of literal reading of the text. So, perhaps one sort of example of this, which is what Ben alluded to earlier, is the whole subject of grace. Well, let me just step back one moment from that, really, and sort of say that the fact is, there's this great gulf, really, between the text and our own world. We're dealing with a very ancient document that didn't have in mind our particular set of issues, if you like. So we can't expect clear-cut, unambiguous answers to questions and dilemmas of the 21st century. The Bible can't provide a manual with step-by-step instructions on, sexuality or genetic engineering or computers or whatever, or for that matter on equal opportunity legislation or civil partnerships or gay marriage. We may perhaps find ways to draw on the wisdom of the Scripture in helping to illumine our kind of quest in these things, but it's not going to give us any kind of clear kind of answers to these sorts of issues. So some people try to bypass this whole business of interpreting the Bible, claiming that they just read it. I hear that all the time. People say, I'm not interpreting the Bible. I just read it. I just believe it, you see. Well, of course, there is no uninterpreted reading of any text, for that matter. But certainly of the Bible. We all create interpretations, whether we're liberals, conservatives, or whoever. The difference is, I think, that good readers of whatever theological persuasion know that they're interpreting and take responsibility for their interpretations. The process can never be neutral or unbiased. It's kind of it's inescapably subjective and therefore necessarily provisional and open to argument, really. And certainly in the approach to the Bible in our own church context, for instance, with children and young people, we go about bringing them into that process of questioning and disputing, if you like, to begin by asking people what they like or don't like about a story or a text and why they don't like it, and therefore to begin to enter into that sort of discussion. The problem with an awful lot of kind of Bible teaching and religious instruction is that it's sort of coming from a position of this is the truth and you have to kind of receive it, rather than opening up a conversation, an argument, a debate in which we are partners in the process. And it seems to me that really is the kind of important thing to do. So interpretation is never a reiteration of the text. It's rather the movement of the text beyond itself in fresh ways, often ways never offered until this moment now. Do you know what I mean? Because we're asking different questions of it now. From a Christian point of view, the core message of the Bible is the gospel, the good news that revolves around Jesus Christ, I'm afraid. But I think at the heart of that is this subject of grace, and it's a word that it has its own religious context, but it's a word that we're also familiar with. The most often repeated definition of grace is that it's unmerited favour. In other words, it's about unconditional love and acceptance. The tragedy to me is that most often churches that stress grace tend to make it mean the exact opposite, that grace is actually the basis of exclusion, that unless you believe these set of propositions or you join this club, you can't be a participant in grace. And therefore grace is a profoundly conditional thing in the way that it's often held and it's preached. Whereas to me, grace is actually one of the most beautiful kind of concepts at the heart of Christianity. It is about the complete unconditional acceptance of each and every person in the sight of God. And the fact is, that an awful lot of the Bible is filtered through this rather heavy-duty kind of patriarchal ideology, and the main task of the reader is to distinguish between the liberating love of God and the attitudes and policies that are kind of organized against it in the Bible itself, as well as in our own world today. Martin Luther King spoke about the arc of history being bent toward justice. This is the way it's going, folks. This is the way the kind of whole trajectory is moving. I would say that the trajectory or the arc of the gospel is bent towards grace and inclusiveness. The assumption that the meaning of the Bible remains a kind of fixed entity over time is to me completely wrong. Within the Bible itself, the text is on the move. There's a trajectory within the Bible, seen at a kind of fundamental level in the trajectory of interpretation between the Old and New Testaments, where the Christ event of the New Testament is a kind of clear and radical interpretation of much that's in the Old Testament. And I think that this kind of mutation of meaning exists even in the Bible, a trajectory of reinterpretation. But it doesn't just stop there, it comes out into the world today. So, we could look at examples of how that trajectory operates, even with the New Testament, where you begin with a Jewish person, Jesus, with a group of Jewish followers, he dies, the Jewish followers set up this new movement, which the assumption is a Jewish movement. And then through the book of Acts, you've got this sort of trajectory of openness coming, where gradually there's a realization that this wasn't just a message for one little community, but it was about God's loving acceptance of the whole world. And then you come to Paul's statement in Galatians, where he says that in Christ there is neither Jew nor Gentile, male nor female, slave nor free, that was a kind of opening up of this sort of trajectory. But it doesn't stop there. It goes beyond the text out into our world today. So I think the focus of attention for biblical interpretation should not be on trying to establish the original intention of the author, which is a kind of pointless thing anyway. It's an impossible thing to know. But rather to turn it round the other way and say, how does this text speak to us today? How does it impact us in our world? And I think the Paul's statement in Galatians, if he were reiterating that in today's world, would certainly include, for instance, there is neither gay nor straight. It's a logical kind of implication of that trajectory. So I think that the interesting thing to me about getting anyone to engage with the Bible is not about handing them this kind of pre-packed ideology which they have to sort of accept or reject, but rather to use it as an entrance point into a conversation, into a debate, into an argument, and then to begin to sort of look at how does this speak or not speak into our world, into our lives, into the issues that we're facing in our world. And in trying to grapple with that, we will always be sort of in this dialectical movement, if you like, or synergy between, looking for a synergy between the kind of deeper meanings of the text that sort of lie beyond the patriarchal or whatever other kind of overlays, and the world in which we live and the sensibilities that we have now come to accept and take as givens.
I think that's a good point to pause,
yes.
Thanks, Dave, and to talk about how we might put some of these ideas into action, how we might interpret the Bible in the classroom in a way that is able to take advantage of those subtleties and nuances. And I've been asked to say a couple of my own ideas, but I think if we go into just a discussion between us very shortly, it seems to make sense, and perhaps steer back into Grace in some questions towards the end. I think we'll probably be adjusting timings. I don't know if we're going to finish bang on 3:20 or we still will. Okay, right, fine. Okay, so my initial thoughts are relating to putting the Bible on trial. I was teaching a lesson last week, and we put 50 Shades of Grey on trial. Quite literally, a prosecution, a defence, a team of judges with a range of different Christian viewpoints, and so on. And Year 9 loved it. It was somewhat controversial, but interesting. So my thought is that I think that we could probably put the Bible on trial as a person. I think that might be an interesting way to get the students to explore in the critical manner that you were describing. I'd like to hear from some of your ideas, and we'll try and get things going backwards and forwards. But should we start with a quick discussion with people on our left and right, and just or open it up directly to you? Mark, would you like a couple of... So, I don't think I do use the Bible very well in my classroom. I think that that it is really very difficult. And actually, I was quite keen to be involved in this discussion because I don't think I do it very well at all. Does anybody feel that they do it very well?
I think it's done. What strikes me about what Deb was saying about, is the Bible true, infallible, right for today? What about topics on which it says nothing, all the rest of it? I mean, I said this to someone who's brought up a happy clappy and is now a devout non-believer, but no one who has read the Bible would, cover to cover, would. I could be very harsh and say no one would take it seriously if they read cover to cover critically. But also, for example, it says in the Bible not to swear and make oath by anything. So all those Christians who go into court and swear on the Bible to tell the truth are disobeying the Bible. It says in the Old Testament you mustn't decorate a tree. So all those churches that have Christmas trees, you could argue. It does say in the Bible you mustn't decorate a tree. So it just strikes me that, where I live in Hackney, there are plenty of people who stand up on the bus and start reading the Bible aloud to you. But even those people clearly don't.
Everybody picks and chooses.
They'll tell you they believe every word of it, but they don't.
Yeah, you're right. Everybody picks and chooses.
Picking and choosing, the dilemma we sometimes face, or it's got into the mindset of a student, is that when you're teaching a topic on, let's say, gender equality, or racial, it's very easy just to nitpick certain passages that support a conservative position on something and a liberal position on something else. And rather than looking at it holistically, that there's a wider context to these verses. So I think we're in danger of doing an injustice to Christianity by just saying, right, in the context of sexual equality, this is what St. Paul said about women being silent in churches, but then you've got the other verse that says about, which you quoted, there's neither Jew nor Greek, male or female, they're all one in Christ. So I think there's that danger of just almost presenting the contradictions as being a problem with the Bible. So I think we need to make sure that we're being fair to the Bible itself as a scripture, as a source, in how we teach it. And if you're applying it in the context of IVF or euthanasia, Jesus wasn't around when these were a problem for us. And then how do you apply those references in those new contexts and those new challenges that we face?
Do you think there's a danger that we've got into a bit of a habit with GCSE of using text, as I'm saying in my Islam session, as proof text? Because the issues have driven the specifications, we've spent, it's been so keen to find a text that will be a liberal or whatever kind of approach to those things, just to provide opportunity for the students to contrast that's so blindingly obvious that they could contrast. And I'd like to see us develop that more so that we're using much more commentary so we can actually say, well, let's take those different texts. What was going on? Who's that speaking to? What's the background to that conversation? How does that interact with another aspect of the Bible and so on? I think we'll give students a far more nuanced understanding of what Christianity and history is all about if we do that.
I think as well, we sometimes might do the students a bit of a disservice. Sort of saying, they couldn't interpret it. They interpret things all the time. They go to English and they read, they might be taught Romeo and Juliet. They don't think Romeo and Juliet literally happened, but they can take out meaning of what Romeo and Juliet
Absolutely.
is. And you talk to a student, I was having a chat to a child on the Coach to Teacher for about an hour about Interstellar, the film, and we decided it wasn't really about space at all. And we had this discussion, and they can do that with films, they can do it with books. So I think that if we gave them the opportunity to do it with religious, but I think you're absolutely right that we're so issue driven that we actually we'll look at the issue and say, right, what do Christians think about abortion? Here's a sentence. What does that tell us about abortion? They go, well, that one sentence there tells them it's wrong.
And then on to the next topic.
Yeah, absolutely.
You're trying to cram through.
Is it about equipping teachers and students with the language to discuss? Because my sixth formers went through kind of revelation in their thinking when we started talking about reading mythos and logos, reading mythologically, seeing when language is mythological and it's Boltman and demythologizing and looking at what's that word supposed to mean, what's that phrase supposed to mean, looking at the context and looking at what parts of the Bible are supposed to be taken mythologically and which are sort of logical language. And if you as a student or as a teacher are equipped with those words, that kind of understanding that there are different types of, you said truth does not equal fact, and I mean obviously you're into a philosophical kind of discussion about meaningfulness as opposed to empirically verifiable. But I think if your students are equipped with those words, they can, and that's what they're doing with Interstellar, isn't it? They're understanding that there's a subtext, and actually when they read Shakespeare, they know it's on 3 different levels. We tell them, but
they know Hamlet isn't real.
Yeah.
And that those people aren't actual people that lived in Norway whenever it was.
Yes. But then the Bible needs to have it. The Bible
or wherever.
There's belief and impact as well, isn't there?
They can take out meaning and they can apply it to themselves quite well.
I suppose what Hamlet would like would be the reason to then act on it, though. You couldn't. Yeah.
Dave, how does this work in terms of as your day job, if you like, about how congregations take to this kind of interpretive approach? How do you see your role in that respect?
Yeah, well, I mean, I'm the vicar of a church which has become well accustomed to the kind of approach that I've just given, really. Not necessarily using technical language or whatever, but they live with, and I feel my task there as, as a teacher or kind of facilitator of their kind of theological development is to expose them to the arguments, to uncover the problems and the arguments and so on within the text and about the text, so that so I think that if I do that in some churches, which I do, I mean, then that's when people call me all the names he said earlier on, because for some people this is absolutely sacrilege, and I think it's really to do with fear. I think that people, their security ties in with a particular ideological kind of belief about the Bible. And I think that it's absolutely crucial. I look at this as crucial with our children and young people in St. Luke's, that I don't want them to have to go through that process, that they are beginning with an introduction into a process of conversation with and about the biblical text.
When I first started my degree, most of you come across this book called The Gospel Parallels. And there was a young woman who's come from the Seventh-day Adventist tradition, and when we started studying it, and she became aware that it was lined in the obvious, that there was parallels, and that one had come from the text had come from Mark. She was horrified, and it shook her because she hadn't had that experience you're describing. It shook her faith to quite a disturbing extent. I mean, she did it. She came back. So she did go through the process you described at the beginning of your talk. So she did come back. But it was deeply disturbing for her because by that time she was 19 by then.
I was 30 before I realised that there's no evidence that Paul met Jesus. I mean, by which time I'd already, long since left the church in which I was brought up. But that was the sort of thing, because the text was never looked at in terms of what else was going on and what was the sort of historical narrative and arc and whatever. And I found out by hearing someone from your tradition saying it on Radio 4 on something like, I don't know, Thought for the Day. I suddenly thought, oh yeah. And it was such a light bulb moment.
Yeah, that's right. I think the truth is, there's, in the church, there's been a kind of conspiracy of silence, of protecting people from the kind of fruits of critical theological thinking that's been around for centuries, a long time. There's not very much new in what's being said today. It's been there for a long time, but it's been closeted away in the academy, as it were, and people have been protected from it. And so then when they suddenly are exposed to it in whatever way, it can be completely devastating, as you say,
I was thinking most people started studying divinity and changed course after a term because they weren't there to have their own beliefs.
Absolutely.
So, if our question is, how do we teach liberal Christianity in a classroom, getting students engaging with the Bible in a way that isn't looking for literal truths but looking for meaning? And I've got quite a quote from here from you, actually. It's that to be good to each other is not wishy-washy. Jesus said what really matters is that we live in a state of love. All the rest is just window dressing. And the danger, of course, is that if we remove all the window dressing, we're left with a be good to each other. I think we could all see how you can use the Bible to come to the conclusion that, yes, that is the central message. How do you think you can impart that to somebody without it sounding like a platitude? Of course you should be good to everybody.
Well, if we could get everyone to be good to each other, that would be a pretty good thing in itself, actually. I mean, often people kind of demean that a bit and say, oh, well, all you're saying is this. Well, actually, that would be pretty good. But I think that, the point about religion, whether it's Christianity, whatever it is, that it's a lens through which we are viewing the world and through which we're interpreting things. So I think it provides a frame, it provides a narrative. I mean, the way I look at different religious traditions is as different linguistic systems. They're different languages that are trying to, in a way, pursue the same thing, trying to express the same thing. But a language has a vocabulary and it has a grammar to it. And the problem is that I think a lot of young people today are growing up without that grammar or vocabulary from Christianity, and that's where the struggle comes. So it's all rather alien, really. And I think that we need to have, and that's why I think knowing the Bible, which is actually so profoundly a part of our culture. I mean, the Bible is everywhere, and so it's deeply embedded in our culture. And yet, I think that a disconnect has come in people's minds as to how to connect things together. So I think it's important that the children, young people, are given, a vocabulary and grammar, as it were, in order to have a conversation. Otherwise, you are just talking about being good and platitudes, So that's what I think that, the job, I think part of what religious education is about, and certainly what my job is about, is trying to give people those tools, And the problem is that I think in religious terms, people end up sort of having arguments about which language is the right one or the best one, and mine is the only true language and all the rest is gobbledygook. Well, what the language is about is trying to express something, to get somewhere, and I think there's great commonality in that. I hate to, move toward a kind of religious Esperanto, where we all it all kind of came down to these few little common. That would be Philistinian in an awful way, I think, really, because there's so much beauty and nuance in different languages as there is in different religious traditions.
But then if you come across the Bible, the big stories, the results, or written histories to work around that. Big brown,
Yeah, I have it.
Yeah, I know a lot of people that have what you're saying about trying to make people biblically literate, if you like. And I think that really helps because it's got quite a good structure around it and a lot of different separate resources. And the same resources wouldn't suit every school in exactly the same way. So you can take things. I think it's a really good resource. I think it's over there actually.
I'll have a look.
You need the Quran with big story as well. The Bhagavad Gita with big stories.
Right.
They're also great trying to put it into that modern context and make it relevant to the students and how they to interpret the Bible and make it relevant to them. So I do think that's good. I think I worry that when you try and make it too relevant to them, you miss the importance of. I hate all the time trying to take religion out of our way of doing it. And again, I don't think we should. And I hate seeing I'm teaching Jesus, I'm teaching the Bible, and thinking that I've got to make some sort of magic plug into it that will take away.
Is that not one of those myths? Somehow, that if we're going to teach something old, like the Bible, somehow we have to start with something that's relevant to them, and as if they somehow can't step into another era.
Well, the Shakespeare example is a good one, isn't it?
I'm sure history colleagues don't sit around and say, what modern hook can I get them into the Romans with?
It's important.
I think some of my boys are too. Why do I want to do all because also to make them religious in some sort of way. Whereas then maybe from primary have understood that they have to do history, they have to do geography. When RE doesn't have the importance of it, it makes you feel like you're always trying to fight them to engage them in that way. When you can engage them and religious, that's brilliant. Yeah.
That's the challenge of the new UCSC now, isn't it? It's much more content heavy on religious practices and beliefs. Philosophy and ethics stuff, which was the most appealing part, was the thing. Thankfully, it hasn't been sacrificed completely. You can still do it, but they have to be much more religiously literate now, don't they? You've got to know the context and the teachings in a lot more detail. I think you explained that in the Strictly RE conference, where the questions are going to be more about not describing it, explain the meaning and significance of a particular idea or notion, which means you've got to have a better understanding of the context of Scripture when you're dealing with it.
Yeah, I mean that obviously the concept of religious literacy is a huge one, and I wonder if the demythologizing, getting people to go through that process of demythologizing can result in perhaps a discovery of something extra. I mean, Boltman's process, I mean, correct me if I'm wrong, but after the process of demythologizing, he realises what's left is not that special. In trying to get to that core essence of the Gospels, he realises that something is fundamentally lost.
And I think in a way the world's moved on since Bultmann, and I think that demythologizing is a turn of phrase that needs some qualification. I think now. I think that we are much more appreciative of the myth, of the text as text, and the uniqueness of how it can speak and convey things. So I think it's right. I think that it would be a bit brutal, I think, if you just sort of take it off like a kind of covering and throw it away and come to this kernel, which is sort of what he was doing. Because somehow it's not as simple as that. It's not a case of you can separate the two. I think the kernel is much more embedded in the text and kind of entwined in it. So I think that looking at the creation myths, for instance, I think particularly in the context of other creation myths and seeing how they are all wrestling to try and it's about meaning, it's about trying to make sense of ourselves and the universe and so on and so forth. And then these myths become, I think, profoundly interesting and engaging, and once you've stopped trying to kind of turn them into a kind of literal ideological statement or something,
I think we are. Well, thanks everybody for coming. And thank you, Dave.
Thank you. No, it's thank you.